Have you ever felt it? A deep and persistent undercurrent of sorrow that seems to run beneath the surface of your entire life. A quiet, melancholic music that plays on, even in your moments of greatest joy. You have achieved success, you have found love, you have experienced pleasure, and yet there is a part of you that remains untouched. A spectator in the back of your own mind who looks upon all of this frantic human drama with a kind of weary and deeply pessimistic wisdom. It is the part of you that knows, on a level deeper than all your comforting illusions, that this is all a fleeting and ultimately quite tragic play. A beautiful, a magnificent, and a heartbreakingly pointless play. You have likely been taught to see this as a form of sickness, a pathology. You have been told that you are depressed, that you are cynical, that you have a negative outlook on life. You live in a civilization that is engaged in a vast, collective, and almost hysterical conspiracy of positivity. A civilization that has turned the pursuit of happiness into a kind of moral and spiritual duty. And your own deep, and often quite secret, sadness is seen not as a form of perception, but as a form of failure. But what if this is a lie? A beautiful, compelling, and deeply impoverished lie? What if your sorrow is not a sign of your sickness, but a sign of your sanity? What if the happy and optimistic people are not the ones who are healthy, but are simply and profoundly asleep? What if your pessimism is not a distortion of reality, but is, in fact, the result of having seen reality with a clarity that is almost too much for a human soul to bear? There was one philosopher in the history of the West who did not just ask these questions, but who built his entire magnificent and terrible philosophical system upon them. His name was Arthur Schopenhauer. He was the great and unflinching poet of pessimism, the ruthless and compassionate physician of the soul's deepest and most secret wounds. He was a thinker who had the immense and terrible courage to look directly into the heart of the human condition, and to not flinch at the horror that he found there. And in his dark, and often quite beautiful, and ultimately profoundly liberating work, he has left us a secret and powerful teaching, that the path to a kind of strange and terrible freedom is not to be found in the flight from suffering, but in the courageous and ultimately quite sacred act of looking it directly and unblinkingly in the eye. 2. Why human desire keeps you miserable no matter what you get. It is a state of profound and almost sacred focus. The world contracts to a single point, the object of your wanting. It may be a person, a position, a possession. You tell yourself a story, a beautiful and deeply convincing story. If I can just have that one thing, then I will be happy. Then I will be whole. Then the quiet, gnawing ache of my own inner emptiness will finally be silenced. And so you strive, you sacrifice. You pour the entirety of your life's energy into the singular and heroic project of its attainment. And then, one day, you get it. The prize is yours. And for a fleeting, glorious moment, you feel a sense of triumph, of relief, of a profound and beautiful peace. The ache is gone. The story was true. But then, something strange and terrible begins to happen. The glow begins to fade. The silence that follows the victory is not a peaceful silence, but a hollow one. And into that hollowness, a new and even more terrible feeling begins to creep. The dead, gray, and soul-crushing feeling of boredom. The old ache, the old restlessness returns, perhaps even stronger than before. And your mind, in a desperate and almost panicked attempt to escape this new and even more terrible form of suffering, immediately and unconsciously latches onto a new desire, a new prize, a new and even more beautiful story. And the entire, tragic, and utterly exhausting cycle begins again. This is the great and defining treadmill of human existence. And it is the central and most devastating of all of Arthur Schopenhauer's psychological insights. The brutal and uncomfortable truth, as Schopenhauer saw it, is that you are not a being who has desires. You are a being who is desire. And the very nature of this desire is to be a state of perpetual and ultimately quite incurable dissatisfaction. The problem is not that you are wanting the wrong things. The problem is that you are wanting it all. Your desire is not the path to your happiness. It is the very engine of your misery. To understand this, you must once again return to Schopenhauer's radical and deeply pessimistic model of reality. The world, he argued, is nothing more than the manifestation of a single, blind, insatiable, and utterly and completely irrational force. He called it the will. The will is a mindless, ceaseless, and ultimately quite pointless striving. And you, your very essence, are a small, and ultimately quite insignificant spark of this great and terrible cosmic fire. Your desires are not your own. They are the will, operating through you. The desire for food, for sex, for power, for status, these are all the clever and often quite cruel tricks of the will designed for a single purpose, the perpetuation of its own blind and meaningless striving. You are a puppet, and your desires are the strings through which this vast and indifferent cosmic puppeteer is making you dance. Life, for Schopenhauer, is a pendulum that swings back and forth between the two poles of human misery. On one side is the pain of striving, the ache of an unfulfilled want. On the other side is the even more terrible pain of boredom, the dead, gray, and soul-crushing emptiness that follows the fleeting and ultimately quite unsatisfying moment of attainment. Most of our lives are spent in the first state, the brief and ultimately quite illusory. Moments of happiness are nothing more than the pendulum's momentary and almost imperceptible pause as it passes through the center point, on its way from one form of suffering to another. This is a worldview that is profoundly and deeply offensive to our modern, optimistic, and deeply self-deceiving sensibilities. We are a civilization that is built on the promise of the attainable desire. The entire, vast, and intricate machinery of our consumer culture is designed to convince you that the next product, the next experience, the next achievement will finally be the thing that silences the ache. It is a brilliant and deeply cynical, and ultimately quite profitable lie. The person who understands Schopenhauer is the person who has begun to see through this lie. They are the person who has looked at their own, long and often quite painful, history of desire and has seen the pattern. They have seen that the prize is never the prize. They have seen that the destination is always a mirage. And they have come to the profound and deeply liberating conclusion that the only way to win the game is to refuse to play it. The path to a kind of strange and terrible peace, for Schopenhauer, is not the path of satisfying your desires, but the path of extinguishing them. It is the path of the ascetic, of the saint, of the person who, through a profound and difficult act of will, turns against the will itself. It is the path of learning to see your own, powerful and compelling, desires not as a sacred command to be obeyed, but as the meaningless and ultimately quite pathetic twitching of a puppet on a string. It is the art of achieving a state of a profound and deeply peaceful detachment from the entire, frantic, and ultimately quite tragic drama of your own wanting. This is a path of profound and almost unbearable difficulty. It is a path that requires you to go to war, not just with the world, but with your own deepest and most fundamental nature. But it is, for Schopenhauer, the only path that leads not to the fleeting and illusory happiness of a satisfied desire, but to the deep and lasting and ultimately quite sacred peace of a desire that has finally and for all time been silenced. 3. The painful reality Schopenhauer saw behind every human life. Have you ever looked at the world, at the grand and intricate tapestry of human existence, and felt a profound and unshakable sense of its inherent tragedy? You see the beauty, you see the joy, you see the moments of love and of triumph. But beneath it all, you sense a deep and constant, and ultimately quite heartbreaking undercurrent of struggle, of pain, of a blind and relentless, and ultimately quite pointless striving. You see the animal kingdom, a vast and beautiful and terrible theater of eat or be eaten. You see human history, a single, long, and almost unbroken story of war, of conflict, of the insatiable and ultimately quite pathetic hunger for power. You look at your own life, at the lives of those around you, and you see the same tragic pattern playing out on a smaller scale. The endless and ultimately quite futile chase after a happiness that is always and forever just out of reach. You have likely been taught to see this as a form of pessimism, a negative and unhealthy way of looking at the world. You have been told by a culture that is pathologically obsessed with the ideals of progress and of positivity that the world is a good place, that life is a gift, that the suffering is just a temporary and unfortunate aberration. But what if this is a lie? A beautiful, a necessary, and a deeply and profoundly dishonest lie? What if the suffering is not the aberration, but the rule? What if the pain is not a bug in the system, but is, in fact, the system itself? This is the radical, the terrifying, and the ultimately quite liberating vision of the great philosopher of pessimism, Arthur Schopenhauer. For Schopenhauer, the painful reality that lies behind every human life is not a complex philosophical doctrine, but a single, simple, and all-encompassing metaphysical truth. And that truth is this: the world is not the product of a loving and rational God. It is the product of a blind and irrational, and ultimately quite cruel, cosmic force. He called it the will. To understand this, you must once again have the immense and terrifying courage to look at reality not as you wish it were, but as Schopenhauer saw it, as it is. For Schopenhauer, the world that we perceive with our senses, the world of objects, of time, of space, the world that we call reality, is, in fact, an illusion. It is what he, following the great German philosopher Immanuel Kant, called the world of phenomena, the world of appearances. It is a dream, a vast, intricate, and deeply convincing projection of our own limited and subjective minds. But behind this dream, behind this veil of Maya, as the Hindu scriptures call it, lies the true and ultimate reality. This is the world of the noumenon, the thing in itself. And this thing in itself, Schopenhauer argued, is not a benevolent and intelligent creator. It is a single, blind, insatiable, and utterly and completely irrational force. It is the will. The will is a mindless, ceaseless, and ultimately quite pointless striving. It is the frantic hunger in the wolf, the relentless growth of the weed, the desperate and ultimately quite tragic ambition in the heart of man. The entire phenomenal world, in all its beautiful and terrible, and ultimately quite meaningless glory, is nothing more than the visible manifestation of this blind and terrible force. And you, your very essence, are a small and ultimately quite insignificant spark of this great and terrible cosmic fire. Yourself, your precious and individual I, is a fiction, a temporary and ultimately quite pathetic eddy in the great and relentless river of the will. Your desires are not your own. Your thoughts are not your own. Your very life is not your own. You are a puppet, and the will is the great and indifferent, and ultimately quite cruel, cosmic puppeteer. This is the painful reality that Schopenhauer saw behind every human life. We are not free and rational agents, striving for a noble and meaningful purpose. We are slaves. We are the galley slaves of the will, chained to the oar of our own, insatiable and ultimately quite pointless desires, rowing with all our might towards a destination that does not exist, on a ship that is, in the end, destined to sink. This is a worldview that is profoundly and deeply offensive to our modern, humanistic, and deeply self-deceiving sensibilities. It is a truth that is almost too terrible to bear. And so, we have invented 1,000 beautiful and elaborate illusions to mask it. We have invented the illusion of progress, the illusion of purpose, the illusion of our own individual and cosmic importance. The path to a kind of strange and terrible peace, for Schopenhauer, is not the path of trying to build a better world, of trying to reform the system. That is an impossible and ultimately quite foolish project. The path is the path of renunciation. It is the path of the ascetic, of the saint, of the person who, through a profound and difficult act of will, turns against the will itself. It is the path of learning to see the entire, frantic, and ultimately quite tragic drama of human existence, not as a thing to be engaged with, but as a thing to be, with a deep and quiet and ultimately quite liberating sense of compassion and of pity let go of. 4. Why happiness is only a brief escape from suffering. It is a rare and beautiful thing. The project is finished, the love is requited, the goal is achieved. In that moment, the constant, grinding, and deeply familiar ache of your own striving self is, for a brief and glorious instant, silenced. You feel a sense of peace, of completion, of a profound and beautiful rightness with the world. You have, you believe, finally arrived. You are happy. And then, what happens? The moment passes. The glow fades. The silence that follows the victory is not a peaceful silence, but a hollow one. And into that hollowness, a new and even more terrible feeling begins to creep. The dead, gray, and soul-crushing feeling of boredom. The old ache, the old restlessness returns, perhaps even stronger than before. And your mind, in a desperate and almost panicked attempt to escape this new and even more terrible form of suffering, immediately and unconsciously latches on to a new desire, a new prize, a new and even more beautiful story of a future happiness. And the entire tragic and utterly exhausting cycle begins again. This is the great and defining treadmill of human existence. And it is a phenomenon that the great philosopher of pessimism, Arthur Schopenhauer, placed at the very center of his entire psychological system. The brutal and uncomfortable truth, as Schopenhauer so brilliantly and so painfully understood, is that happiness is not the goal of a human life. It is a brief and ultimately quite illusory pause in its true and fundamental state, which is suffering. Happiness in the Schopenhauerian universe is not a positive and substantive reality in itself. It is merely the temporary and fleeting cessation of a pre-existing pain. It is a brief escape, and like all escapes, it is by its very nature doomed to end. To understand this, you must once again return to Schopenhauer's radical and deeply pessimistic model of reality. The world, he argued, is nothing more than the manifestation of a single, blind, insatiable, and utterly and completely irrational force. He called it the will. The will is a mindless, ceaseless, and ultimately quite pointless striving. And you, your very essence, are a small, and ultimately quite insignificant spark of this great and terrible cosmic fire. The natural and default state of this will is a state of wanting. It is a state of deficit, of lack, of a perpetual and unfulfillable hunger. This, for Schopenhauer, is the very definition of suffering. To be a living being is to be a being that wants, and to be a being that wants is to be a being that is, by its very nature, in a state of pain. And what is happiness? Happiness is the moment, the brief and fleeting moment, when a single one of these countless wants is, for an instant, satisfied. It is the moment when the starving man is given a piece of bread, when the thirsty man is given a drink of water. In that moment, the pain of that particular hunger is, for a moment, silenced. And this silence, this temporary absence of pain, is what we, in our naive and deeply deluded way, call happiness. But the will is a hydra. For every one of its heads that you cut off, 2 more will grow in its place. The satisfaction of a desire is not the end of desire. It is the beginning of a new one. And if, by some strange and terrible miracle, you were to satisfy all of your desires at once, you would not be left in a state of a lasting and blissful peace. You would be plunged into the second, and even more terrible, of the two great hells of human existence, the hell of boredom. Boredom, for Schopenhauer, is not a trivial and passing annoyance. It is a state of profound and existential terror. It is the feeling of a life that has been stripped of all its striving, of all its purpose, of all its forward momentum. It is the terrible and unbearable emptiness of a will that has nothing left to will. It is, in a very real sense, a glimpse into the abyss of our own ultimate and terrifying meaninglessness. And it is a state so unbearable that the human mind will do anything to escape it. It will invent a new desire, a new game, a new and ultimately quite pointless struggle, simply to have something to do, simply to escape from the terrible and deafening silence of its own empty and satisfied self. This is the great and tragic pendulum of human life, as Schopenhauer saw it. We are forever swinging back and forth between the two poles of our own self-inflicted misery, the hot, sharp, and striving pain of desire, and the cold, gray, and empty pain of boredom. The brief and beautiful moments that we call happiness are nothing more than the momentary and almost imperceptible pause as the pendulum passes through its center point, on its way from one form of suffering to another. The path to a kind of strange and terrible peace, for Schopenhauer, is not the path of trying to find a lasting happiness. That is a fool's errand, a child's game. The path is the path of renunciation. It is the path of learning to slowly, and with a great and difficult effort, to extinguish the very fire of your own wanting. It is the path of the ascetic, of the saint, of the person who has understood that the only way to win the game is to refuse to play it. It is the art of achieving a state of a profound and deeply peaceful detachment from the entire, frantic, and ultimately quite tragic, and deeply and profoundly human drama of your own, and the world's endless and ultimately quite futile pursuit of a happiness that was never and could never be real. 5. The paradox of the human will. Why we sabotage our own peace. You have a clear and rational desire for a life of peace, of stability, of a quiet and gentle happiness. And yet, you find yourself, time and time again, making choices that lead to the exact opposite. You are drawn to the chaotic relationship. You are addicted to the stressful drama. You are a moth to the flame of your own self-destructive impulses. You are a person who is consciously and deliberately building a beautiful and orderly house, while a secret and powerful part of you is, in the dead of night, just as deliberately and just as systematically burning it to the ground. You have likely looked at this strange and terrible paradox with a sense of profound and helpless despair. You have berated yourself for your own irrational and self-sabotaging behavior. You have declared a war on this dark and unruly part of yourself, believing that if you could just conquer it, if you could just force your own chaotic nature into a state of a final and absolute submission, then you would finally be at peace. But what if this is a catastrophic mistake? What if the problem is not that you have a dark side that is at war with your good side? What if the problem is that your very desire for peace, for happiness, for a final and lasting state of contentment is, in and of itself, a lie, a fiction, a profound and tragic misunderstanding of the very nature of your own being? This is the radical, the terrifying, and the ultimately quite liberating insight of the great philosopher of pessimism, Arthur Schopenhauer. For Schopenhauer, the reason we sabotage our own peace is not because we are broken, but because we are, in a very real and tragic sense, being true to our own deepest and most fundamental nature. And that nature is not one of peace. It is one of a blind, a relentless, and an ultimately quite pointless striving. To understand this, you must once again have the immense and terrifying courage to look at reality not as you wish it were, but as Schopenhauer saw it, as it is. For Schopenhauer, the world, and your own inner world, is nothing more than the manifestation of a single, blind, insatiable, and utterly and completely irrational force. He called it the will. The will is a mindless, ceaseless, and ultimately quite pointless striving. It is the very essence of existence itself. And you, your very essence, are a small, and ultimately quite insignificant, spark of this great and terrible cosmic fire. The will does not want peace. The will does not want happiness. The will does not want a final and lasting state of contentment. The will wants only one thing: to strive, to want, to overcome. The state of peace, of a satisfied and contented desire, is, to the will, a state of death. It is a void, a stasis, an unbearable and terrifying nothingness. The will is a fire, and its only purpose is to burn. And you, a manifestation of this will, are a fire. Your conscious mind, your ego, with its gentle and civilized desire for a quiet and peaceful life, is a small and terrified child, trying to build a sandcastle on the edge of a volcano. The deep and terrible truth of your being is that you are, on a fundamental and non-negotiable level, a creature of the struggle. You are an addict, and your drug is the fight itself. This is the great and tragic paradox of the human will. We consciously desire a state of peace, but we are, on a deep and unconscious level, terrified of it. And so we sabotage it. The moment we achieve a measure of success, a moment of peace, a state of a quiet and gentle contentment, the deep and ancient and terrifyingly powerful machinery of the will kicks in. It finds the state of non-striving to be unbearable. And so it will invent a new problem, a new drama, a new and ultimately quite pointless conflict, simply to have something to do, simply to feel the glorious and intoxicating sensation of its own striving and life-affirming power. You are not sabotaging your own peace because you are a masochist. You are sabotaging it because the state of peace is, to the deepest part of your being, a state of profound and terrifying unaliveness. You are choosing the painful and familiar thrill of the struggle over the strange and terrifyingly empty reality of a life without it. The path to a kind of strange and terrible peace, for Schopenhauer, is not the path of trying to build a better and more stable life for yourself. That is an impossible and ultimately quite foolish project. The path is the path of renunciation. It is the path of the ascetic, of the saint, of the person who, through a profound and difficult act of will, turns against the will itself. It is the path of learning to slowly, and with a great and difficult effort, to extinguish the very fire of your own striving and self-sabotaging nature. It is the art of achieving a state of a profound and deeply peaceful detachment from the entire, frantic and ultimately quite tragic, and deeply and profoundly human trauma of your own, and the world's endless and ultimately quite futile pursuit of a peace that you were, in fact, never designed to have. 6. Why intelligent people often feel more pain. You look at the world, at the people around you, at the simple, unself-conscious, and seemingly quite happy way in which they move through their lives, and you feel a profound, almost unbearable sense of envy. You, with your complex, analytical, and deeply self-aware mind, seem to be living in a different and far more difficult world. You see the contradictions they ignore, the illusions they embrace, the vast and tragic patterns of existence that they, in their blissful and comforting ignorance, are completely blind to. You are a person who has been cursed with a form of sight that allows you to see the bars of your own and everyone else's cage. You have been taught to see your intelligence as a great and powerful asset. In a purely practical and instrumental sense, this is true. But what if, on a deeper and far more important existential level, it is a liability? What if the path to a happy and contented life is not the path of greater understanding, but is in fact the path of a certain strategic and ultimately life-affirming form of blindness? This is the radical, terrifying, and ultimately liberating insight of the great philosopher of pessimism, Arthur Schopenhauer. For Schopenhauer, the reason that intelligent people so often feel more pain is not a coincidence. It is a law of nature. For to be intelligent is to have a thinner skin, a clearer eye, and a more profound and tragic relationship with the great and terrible truth of existence. To understand this, you must grasp Schopenhauer's stark hierarchy of suffering. All of life, he argued, is a manifestation of the blind, striving, and perpetually dissatisfied cosmic will. And all of life, therefore, is in a state of suffering. But the capacity to suffer is not distributed equally. The amount of pain a being can experience is in direct proportion to its level of intelligence and consciousness. A stone which has no consciousness does not suffer. A plant which has a dim and rudimentary form of life suffers very little. An animal with its more complex nervous system suffers more. The normal human being, a creature of instinct and of herd mentality, suffers more still. But the person of genius, the individual with a truly powerful and luminous intellect, stands at the very apex of this terrible pyramid. They are the creature that has been endowed with the greatest and most terrible of all capacities, the capacity for an almost infinite suffering. Why? Because intelligence, for Schopenhauer, is the great destroyer of illusions. The normal person is protected from the raw and terrifying truth of their condition by a thick and comforting blanket of cognitive biases and comforting fictions. They believe in their own individual importance. They believe in the meaning of their own frantic and ultimately absurd pursuits. They are so engrossed in the small, immediate traumas of their own ego that they have no time and no inclination to look up and to see the vast, cold, and indifferent cosmos in which these dramas are taking place. They are, in a very real sense, asleep. The intelligent person is the person who is cursed with the inability to sleep. Their intellect is a searchlight that is constantly and ruthlessly illuminating the dark and uncomfortable corners of reality. They see, with a profound and terrible clarity, that their own precious and individual self is a fiction, a temporary and ultimately insignificant manifestation of a blind and indifferent cosmic force. They see that all of their striving, all of their ambitions, all of their loves are not their own, but are simply the clever and often cruel tricks of the will, designed to keep them on the endless and ultimately pointless treadmill of existence. They see the great, tragic, and inescapable pattern of suffering that governs all of life. This clarity does not liberate them, it crucifies them. Their intelligence has not freed them from the prison. It has simply made them acutely and terribly aware of the thickness of its walls and the utter impossibility of their own ultimate escape. Every new piece of knowledge, every new insight, is not a step towards a happier life. It is another bar in the window of their own, ever more constricting cell. This is the great and terrible paradox of the thinking life. It is the choice between a blissful and comforting ignorance and a lucid, heartbreaking, and deeply and profoundly human despair. The intelligent person does not just feel their own pain more acutely. They feel the pain of the entire world. They have become a raw and exposed nerve ending for the suffering of all existence. And that is a burden that is almost too great for any single soul to bear. 7. The lonely freedom that comes from expecting nothing. A cherished hope has been dashed. A trusted person has betrayed you. A life you had so carefully planned has been torn apart by the cruel and indifferent hand of fate. In that moment, you are in the grip of a profound and terrible suffering. And the source of that suffering is not the event itself, but the vast and gaping chasm between the world as it is and the world as you believed it should be. You are not being punished by reality. You are being punished by your own beautiful and ultimately quite foolish expectations. You have likely spent your entire life trying to manage this problem by trying to manage the world. You have tried to make better plans, to choose more trustworthy people, to build a fortress of security that will be strong enough to protect you from the unpredictable storms of life. You have, in essence, tried to bend the world to your will, and you have, more often than not, failed. The world you have discovered with a quiet and growing sense of despair is a wild and untamable beast. But what if there is a different path? A stranger, a colder, and a far more radical path to a kind of peace? What if the secret to ending your suffering is not to try to make the world conform to your desires, but to have the immense and terrifying courage to extinguish your desires altogether? This is the dark and deeply liberating insight that lies at the heart of the practical philosophy of Arthur Schopenhauer. For Schopenhauer, the reason we suffer is not because the world is a bad place, but because we are creatures who expect it to be a good one. The brutal and uncomfortable truth is that the only true and lasting form of freedom is the lonely, and ultimately quite peaceful freedom that comes from learning to expect absolutely and completely nothing. To understand this, you must once again return to Schopenhauer's core diagnosis of the human condition. Life, he argued, is a state of perpetual and unavoidable suffering. We are manifestations of a blind striving and eternally dissatisfied cosmic will. Our natural state is one of wanting, of lacking, of a deep and unquenchable thirst. To expect anything other than this is a form of madness. To expect the world to be a place of lasting happiness, of fairness, of a just and benevolent order, is like expecting a river to flow uphill. The person who is a slave to their own expectations is a person who is in a state of a constant and losing war with reality. Every time the world fails to live up to their inner picture of how it should be, they are plunged into a state of rage, of grief, of a profound and self-pitying sense of victimhood. Their inner peace is a fragile and precarious thing, a hostage to the fickle and often quite brutal whims of fortune. The path to freedom, for Schopenhauer, is the path of a radical and systematic renunciation. It is the art of learning to slowly, and with a great and difficult effort, to extinguish the very fire of your own wanting. It is the path of the ascetic, of the saint, of the person who has understood that the only way to win the game is to refuse to play it. This is not a path of cynical resignation. It is a path of a profound and deeply strategic psychological warfare against your own suffering-creating mind. It is the practice of what can be called negative expectation. You do not hope for the best. You prepare for the worst. You enter into a new relationship not with the naive and hopeful expectation that this person will be your savior, but with the calm and sober understanding that they are a flawed and self-interested human being who will, with an almost mathematical certainty, eventually disappoint you. You embark on a new project, not with the optimistic belief that it will be a glorious and unqualified success, but with the quiet and realistic acceptance that it will be fraught with difficulty, with setbacks, and with the very real possibility of a complete and total failure. When you live in this way, a strange and miraculous thing happens. The power of the world to hurt you begins to dissolve. The betrayal that would have shattered the hopeful person is, for you, merely a sad and predictable confirmation of your own clear-eyed view of human nature. The failure that would have crushed the optimist is, for you, simply a data point, an expected and not particularly interesting part of the process. You have not eliminated the suffering of the world. You have simply removed your own, ego's, desperate and noisy commentary on it. This is the lonely freedom of the person who expects nothing. It is a cold and quiet freedom. It is a freedom that has been purchased at the price of all your warm and comforting illusions. But it is a freedom that is real. It is a freedom that is indestructible. It is the freedom of the stone, of the mountain. of the person who has so completely and so totally aligned themselves with the hard and unforgiving reality of the world that they can no longer be broken by it. 8. Why life hurts more when you think too deeply. You are analyzing a problem, a relationship, the state of the world, and you are going deeper and deeper, peeling back layer after layer of the comforting and superficial explanations. And as you go deeper, you feel a strange and terrible transformation taking place. The world that once seemed so solid, so simple, so full of a naive and cheerful possibility begins to dissolve. It is replaced by a vision of a world that is infinitely more complex, more contradictory, and more tragic than you had ever imagined. You have not found the answer you were looking for. You have found 1,000 new and even more difficult questions. And you are left not with a sense of a triumphant and empowering clarity, but with a sense of a profound and deeply isolating and ultimately quite heartbreaking sorrow. You have likely been taught to see this as a noble and virtuous activity. You are a deep thinker, a philosopher, a person who is not afraid to grapple with the big questions. But what if this is a lie? A beautiful, a seductive, and a deeply and profoundly dangerous lie? What if the act of thinking too deeply is not a path to wisdom, but a path to a form of suffering so profound and so absolute that it can threaten to extinguish the very will to live? This is the radical, the terrifying, and the ultimately quite compassionate warning of the great philosopher of pessimism, Arthur Schopenhauer. For Schopenhauer, the reason that life hurts more when you think too deeply is not because you are a sensitive soul, but because you are, in a very real and tragic sense, pulling back the curtain on the great and terrible, and ultimately quite meaningless machinery of existence itself. Your pain is not a neurosis, it is a perception, and it is a perception of a truth that the human mind was, perhaps never designed to bear. To understand this, you must once again have the immense and terrifying courage to look at reality not as you wish it were, but as Schopenhauer saw it, as it is. For Schopenhauer, the world that we perceive with our senses, the world of the individual, of the ego, of the coherent and meaningful story, is an illusion. It is the world of phenomena, the veil of Maya. It is a dream, a beautiful and deeply convincing dream that is being projected by our own individual and subjective minds. The normal person, the person who does not think too deeply, lives their entire life within this dream. Their world is a small, a personal, and a deeply meaningful one. Their own small life is the center of the universe. Their own small dramas are of a cosmic and ultimate importance. They are the hero of their own private movie. And this is a state of a profound and in many ways quite enviable happiness. The person who begins to think too deeply is the person who has, for some reason, begun to see through this dream. Their intellect, which our culture celebrates as our greatest and most noble faculty, is, for Schopenhauer, a kind of terrible and corrosive acid. It is the force that dissolves the beautiful and life-giving illusions. The deep thinker begins to see that their own precious and individual self is a fiction, a temporary and ultimately quite insignificant manifestation of a blind and indifferent cosmic force that Schopenhauer called the will. They begin to see that all of their striving, all of their ambitions, all of their loves are not their own, but are simply the clever and often quite cruel tricks of this will, designed to keep them on the endless and ultimately quite pointless treadmill of their own existence. They begin to see the great, tragic, and inescapable pattern of suffering that governs all of life. The more they think, the more they understand. The more they understand, the more they see the pattern. The more they see the pattern, the more they see the futility. The more they see the futility, the more they suffer. Their intelligence has not liberated them from the prison. It has simply made them acutely and terribly aware of the thickness of its walls and of the utter and complete impossibility of their own ultimate escape. This is the great and terrible paradox of the thinking life. It is the choice between a blissful and comforting ignorance and a lucid and ultimately quite heartbreaking and deeply and profoundly human despair. The deep thinker has traded the simple and naive happiness of the participant for the complex and tragic and lonely wisdom of the spectator. And that is a trade that, once made, can never, ever be undone. 10. The dark wisdom of embracing reality as it really is. A terrible thing has happened. A loss, a failure, a betrayal, a period of immense and grinding pain. And your mind is consumed by a single and ultimately quite useless and deeply human cry. This shouldn't be happening. You are at war with reality. You are insisting that the universe should be other than it is. You are clinging to a beautiful and now shattered illusion of a world that is fair, that is just, that is kind. And in this resistance, in this refusal to accept the brutal and unforgiving truth of what is, lies the source of your deepest and most profound suffering. You have been taught by your entire progress-obsessed and deeply optimistic culture that this resistance is a virtue. You have been taught to fight, to strive, to never give up, to believe in the power of your own will, to bend the world to your desires. You believe that to accept a terrible reality is a form of weakness, of surrender, of a pathetic and cowardly pessimism. But what if this is a lie? A beautiful, a noble, and a deeply and profoundly exhausting lie? What if the path to a kind of strange and terrible peace is not to be found in the heroic and ultimately quite futile struggle to change reality, but in the far more difficult and far more courageous act of learning to see it? This is the final, the most challenging, and the most profoundly liberating of all of Arthur Schopenhauer's dark and beautiful teachings. The brutal and uncomfortable truth is that your suffering is not caused by the harshness of reality. It is caused by your refusal to accept it. The dark wisdom of Schopenhauer is this: the only true and lasting form of freedom is to be found in the complete and total and ultimately quite peaceful surrender to the beautiful and terrible, and utterly and completely indifferent truth of the world as it really is. To understand this, you must once again have the immense and terrifying courage to look at reality not as you wish it were, but as Schopenhauer saw it, as it is. For Schopenhauer, the world is the manifestation of a single, blind, irrational, and eternally striving force that he called the will. This will is not good. It is not evil. It is simply and profoundly and terrifyingly indifferent. It is a world of ceaseless and ultimately quite pointless conflict. It is a world in which suffering is not an anomaly, but is the very fabric of existence. The normal person, the person who is a slave to their own hopeful and deeply deluded illusions, cannot bear this. They live in a state of a constant and losing war with this reality. Every time the world presents them with a piece of its own brutal and indifferent truth, they recoil in horror. They deny it, they rationalize it, they project it. They invent 1,000 beautiful and elaborate stories to protect themselves from the terrible and liberating light of the real. They invent the story of a just God, of a benevolent universe, of a future utopia in which all of this suffering will finally, and for all time, be redeemed. Their entire life is a work of fiction. The path of the Schopenhauerian sage is the path of the ruthless and uncompromising realist. It is the path of learning to slowly, and with a great and difficult effort, to dismantle this entire, beautiful, and life-denying edifice of lies. It is the art of learning to see the world and your own soul with the cold, clear, and unflinching gaze of a surgeon. This is not a path of cynical resignation. It is a path of a profound and deeply courageous acceptance. But in a far darker and more radical key than Nietzsche's. It is not the joyful and triumphant yes of the warrior who loves the struggle. It is the quiet and sober and ultimately quite peaceful yes of the sage who has understood that the struggle is, in fact, all there is, and that to fight against it is the ultimate form of madness. To embrace reality as it really is to accept that you are a small, a temporary, and an ultimately quite insignificant manifestation of a vast and indifferent cosmic force. It is to accept that your own precious and individual self is a fiction. It is to accept that your suffering is not a personal and tragic affliction, but is simply your small and unremarkable share of the great and universal suffering of all existence. When you can do this, a strange and miraculous thing happens. The desperate and ego-driven and ultimately quite useless struggle against reality comes to an end. The anger, the resentment, the self-pity, all of the second arrows that we shoot into ourselves after the first, and unavoidable arrow of life's pain has struck, they all begin to dissolve. You have not eliminated the suffering of the world. You have simply removed your own, frantic and noisy, and ultimately quite pathetic commentary on it. And in that silence, in that quiet and sober acceptance of the great and terrible truth, you will not find the happiness you have always been chasing. You will find something far more precious. You will find a kind of peace, a cold, a clear, and an utterly and completely indestructible peace. And so, we arrive at the end of our journey into the dark, and often quite chilling, landscapes of Arthur Schopenhauer's thought, and we are left with a single stark and life-altering realization. The life you have been living, the world you have been taught to believe in, is a lie. It is a beautiful, a comforting, and a deeply and profoundly dishonest lie. It is a fairy tale, a story of a just and meaningful universe, of an attainable and lasting happiness, of a noble and heroic human purpose that we have been telling ourselves for centuries, to protect our fragile egos from a truth that is almost too terrible to bear. The lessons of Schopenhauer are not a comforting philosophy. They are a hammer. They are a set of brutally effective tools for the systematic and often quite painful demolition of this prison of lies. He has shown us that our understanding amplifies our pain, that our desires are an engine of perpetual misery, that the very fabric of our existence is a blind and striving will. He has revealed that happiness is nothing more than a fleeting pause between two states of suffering, that we sabotage our own peace because our very nature is one of struggle. He has taught us that intelligence is a magnet for pain, that the only true freedom is to be found in expecting nothing, that deep thought leads not to a solution, but to a more profound sorrow, that fulfillment is an illusion, and that our only sane and rational response to this tragic and beautiful, and ultimately quite meaningless, drama is a profound and total, and ultimately quite peaceful surrender. This is the great and terrible freedom that Schopenhauer offers us. It is not the freedom to have what we want. It is the freedom from the tyranny of wanting itself. It is not the freedom from suffering. It is the freedom to see our suffering for what it truly is, and in that seeing, to rob it of its personal and terrifying power. It is the freedom that comes not from a naive and self-deceiving optimism, but from a cold, clear-eyed, and ultimately quite liberating pessimism. The door to the prison of our own hopeful and self-defeating illusions is not locked. It has been open all along. The only question is whether we will have the immense and terrifying courage to walk through it and to finally enter the real and unforgiving and ultimately quite beautiful world.